This is part 66 of jQuery tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to suggest an available unique username using ASP.NET Web Services and jQuery AJAX. We'll be working with the same example that we worked with in part 65, so please watch part 65 before proceeding. Here is what we want to achieve. When we create a Gmail account, we will have to provide a username. Let's enter email to Sarah as the username. And look at this. When the text box loses focus, we get a validation message. Someone already has that username. Try another. And then it displays an available unique username. So it says email to Sarah 9 is available. And look at how they have computed this available username. To the username that we have entered within this username text box, they have appended a random number, in this case number 9. Look at this. When the text box loses focus again, this time they have appended 382 to this username that we have entered, right? And this available username is a hyperlink. So when I click on this available username, look at what happens. That username is populated in the username text box and all the messages goes away. So let's see how to achieve this using ASP.NET Web Services and jQuery AJAX. And here is the example that we worked with in the previous video session. At the moment, when we type a username, if that username is available, it says it's available. If it's not available, we know that Pamela is already present in the database and in use, so it says Pamela already in use. So if the username is in use, then let's see how to suggest a unique username that's available. Okay, just like Gmail. So let's flip to Visual Studio. The first thing that we are going to do is change this ASP.NET Web Service method. So at the moment we have got this username exists function, which is writing this registration object to the current response stream. Okay, we discussed this function in detail in the previous video session, so I'm not going to go over it. I'm going to change this function. So at the moment the return type is void. I'm actually going to change it to Boolean. And I don't require this private variable, so I'm going to get rid of that from there. And I want this function to return true or false. It's going to return true if the username is already taken, otherwise it returns false. Okay, so here we're retrieving, from the DB whether if the username is available or not, and we are going to return that Boolean value back. Okay, and we don't require all this code, so I'm going to delete all this code. Okay, now this function username exists, this simply returns true or false. If the username is in use, then it returns true. Otherwise, if it's available, it's going to return false. Okay, now I'm going to create another web method. So let's actually copy these lines and paste here, and let's change the name of the function to get available username. Okay, and let's change the return type to void. And now the first thing that I'm going to do here is create an instance of registration class, and let's call this registration equals new registration. Now first we are going to assume that the username is not in use, so I'm going to set this property username in use to false. Okay, and then I'm going to use a while loop here and call this function username exists. This function returns true or false, so I'm going to call this function username exists while username exists, and to this function we need to pass the username that the user has typed into the text box, and we have a parameter coming into this function, so I'm going to pass that username. Okay, so now what is this function going to do? This function will return true if the username is already in use. If the username is already in use, then what we want to do, we want to compute a random number, append that to the username that the user has typed in the text box, right? So to compute the random number, I'm going to use a random class, and let's call it random equals new random, and I'm going to create a variable of type integer. Let's call it random number equals, we are going to use the random object, and on that let's go ahead and call the next function, and I'm going to use this overloaded version where we can specify a minimum and maximum value. So I want a random number to be generated between 1 and 100. So that's what these two parameters specify. So we have a random number now. All that is left is to append that to our username. So username equals username plus random number, and I'm going to convert that to a string. Okay, now when is this going to come into this block? It will come into this block if the username exists function returns true. If the username exists function returns true, what does that mean? That username is already in use, and that's the reason why we are computing a new username by appending a random number. Okay, so that's the reason I'm going to set username in use property to true. So basically this tells us that the username that the user has entered on the UI is in use, and we are computing a new username by appending a random number. Okay, now once it comes out of this while loop, that means we have identified a username that is available for use, and I'm going to store that in the registration object. So registration object has got username property as well, and I'm going to set that to whatever username is available. So let's quickly understand this code. Now let's say, for example, on the UI we type Pamela. We know Pamela username is already in use. It exists in our database. So we pass that, whatever you have typed, that is Pamela in this case, to this function, and it comes here. It initially sets username in use property of the registration object to false, and it comes to this function. So Pamela is passed to username exists. What is this function going to do? It's going to return true because that username already exists in the database. It's already in use. And if this function returns true, then it's going to get into this while loop, create a random object, and we are generating a random number between 1 and 100, and to that username Pamela we are appending random number. Let's say we have generated a random number of 5. So the username now will be Pamela 5, and the username initially we have provided is in use. That's why we are setting this property username in use to true. Okay, and then it goes back to the while loop again because this returned true. So now when it comes, username contains Pamela 5, and that's what will be checked against the database. In the database we don't have Pamela 5, so what is this function going to do? It's going to return false. When it returns false, what is it going to do? It's going to break that while loop, and it comes here and it sets that username as the value for username property of the registration object. So username of the registration object contains Pamela 5. Okay, so all that is left now is to serialize this registration object and write it to the response stream. So to serialize it to the JSON object, I'm going to use JavaScript serializer, and let's call the serialize function and pass the registration object, and let's write that serialized string to the current context. So context.response.write. Alright, so let's go ahead and build this solution, and let's view this web service in the browser. So now this web service should actually be exposing two functions. Now we don't really need to call this username exists function, so there is no need to expose this as a web method. So what I'm going to do is actually get rid of web method attribute from that function, save the changes, build the solution. Let's go ahead and reload this. So now we should have only get available username. Let's click that. Now let's type Mark, for example. So we don't have such a user in the DB. So when we click invoke, look at that, username in use, Mark is not in use, so that's why it's returning false. And that's the username that we have entered in this case, so it returns that. But we know Pamela username is in use. So when I type, look at that, Pamela, and invoke this, look at what we get back. Username in use, yes, Pamela username is already in use. So it has computed a unique username that's available, in this case Pamela 4. Look at the random number it has appended is 4, and it returned that. Okay, so now all that is left is to actually call this web service method from the UI, okay, using jQuery code. So let's go ahead and do that. So now here next to the div element, I'm going to include a span element. Let's give the span element an ID. I'm going to call this span available username, and I'm going to create a link element as well, a hyperlink element. So anchor, and let's actually call this link available username, and let's set the href attribute to hash. So when you click on the hyperlink, it actually takes you nowhere. We just want to make that available username clickable. So you may be wondering, why do we added these two elements? The reason is, if you look at Gmail right here, notice that we have the validation message, and then we have this text available, and then the email that is available. So we will be displaying this text available within the span element, and this username that's available within that anchor element. That's the reason why we have added those two. Okay, so now let's go to jQuery code. So now the function within the web service that we want to call is getAvailable username. So let's copy this function name and specify that right here. Okay, and we want to issue a post request. The data that we want to send to the user, to the web service, is the username that the user has typed on the UI, and the type of data that we are expecting from the server is JSON data. And when the request completes successfully, this is the callback function that we want to call, and the registration object will be passed to this data object. So this data object is going to contain username in use and username properties. Okay, so if username in use, if this property returns true, what does that mean? Whatever we have typed into the username text box initially, that username is in use. So that means we would have computed a unique username that's available, and the username property of the data object will contain that available username. So at that point, we want to say username already in use, just like Gmail, try another, and let's put a question mark. Okay, and then within the span element, we want to display that word available. And notice here we are storing the reference of div element within this variable. Similarly, let's store the reference of span element and the anchor element. And if you look at the ID of the span element, it is span available username. So let's find that, and let's actually call that span element. And the ID of the link element is link available username, and let's call this link element. Okay, so if the username is already in use, we want to display that validation message. And within the span element, so we have span element dot text. So the text that we want to display within that span element is available and a colon symbol. And then we have the link element. Within the link element, what we want to display? We want to display the available username. Okay, and where do we get the available username from? From the username property of the data object that this callback function is receiving. Okay, so that's what we should do. If the username that we have provided is already in use, it's going to come to this else block if the username that we have provided is available, right? So at that point, if we are already displaying anything within the within the span and link elements, what do we want to do? We want to empty that. So I'm going to actually copy and paste those two lines here and empty the text that is displayed within the span element and within the hyperlink element. Okay, so let's go ahead and save the changes. Let's reload our HTML page, and look at this. When I type Pam, so this username is available, so it displays the message as usual. And Pamela, look at that, it says Pamela74 already in use, try another, and available Pamela74. Now this error message here is misleading, because Pamela74 is the username that's available, right? This is not the username that we have typed here. So basically it should say Pamela already in use, try another, right? The reason why it is showing here the available unique username is because we're using the username property of the data object. Now to get the username that the user has typed in the text box, use this variable, right? Because that's what is receiving the value that the user has typed in the text box. So let's copy that and paste it right here. So save the changes. Let's reload this page. Now it should say whatever we have typed into the text box. So Pamela already in use, try another. Pamela 98 is available, and this is a hyperlink. Now when I click on this, we should actually populate that within this text box, and we should clear out these messages from here. Okay, basically the div element, span element, and the link element. We should empty everything. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So here we are setting the text for the hyperlink element, and I'm also going to chain the click event handler function. So when we click the hyperlink, we want to execute some code which is going to be part of this anonymous function. So what do we want to do at that point? When we click on this hyperlink, we want to store that username in that username text box. And here we already have the username text box selector. So let's copy that, and I'm going to say that username dot val. So the value of that is going to come from $this dot text. So what is this code doing here? What does this keyword refer to here? Now we are within the context of the hyperlink element, so this keyword references the hyperlink element, and we are calling the text property. So we will retrieve the username that's available, and we are going to store that in this username text box, right? And once we are done that, what we need to do, we need to empty out the div element, span element, and the link element itself. So I'm actually going to, so div element dot text, let's empty that. Similarly, span element and hyperlink element. Okay. Alright, so let's go ahead and save those changes as well. Reload this page, and let's type. So Pam is available, and Pamela already in use, try another. Pamela 56, and look at that. When I click on that, we have that stored there in the text box, and all the validation messages are gone. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.